The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 761 Dragon's Hoard. The dwarf had somewhat regained some spirit energy in his body after absorbing it from the spirit stone, although that only made him more sensitive to the horrible condition his body was in. Silently, he cursed the stupid dragon, then audibly he cursed again, filthy stupid stinking dragon. Since the dwarf no longer dared to cross Lex, he could only change the target of all his hatred and anguish to the dragon itself. The dragon's obsession is much stronger than anything we expected. Even with all our protection and preparation, we still lost ourselves to the spirit pull. Speaking of the dragon, aren't you at all worried about aggravating the dragon? Or are you so sure that the dragon is actually dead? Were you the ones who spread that news? No, we weren't the ones who spread the news. But they are working with us, the dwarf said, and he suppressed the urge to moan. The little vitality Lex had provided him was far from enough to heal anything at all, but there was not much he could really do about it. I don't know how or why, only Barley, the leader of our group, knows the details, but the dragon is for sure dead. Otherwise, we would never agree to go and steal from a living dragon's hoard. Even if we cannot get our hands on the treasure that has been tainted with the dragon's obsession, any random item will be worth the risk. A dragon's hoard, to be honest, I cannot even estimate how much it would be worth. All I can say is that it should be worth a lot. Why did you spread the news of the dragon's death? Wouldn't you end up getting more competition if the knowledge is spread? In contrast, if you keep the knowledge hidden, you have a greater chance to take all the loot for yourself. No, we can't face the strength of the royal family on our own. Spreading the news is dangerous, as it could attract other races as well, but it also presented us with an opportunity to infiltrate the palace. The various noble families attacked the royal family with the desire to get their hands on dragon blood. With that, they can change their own fate and replace the royal family. Maybe they could even cause a mutation and transform into a real dragon, since they are dragon descendants at the end of the day. Such a conversion is still possible. Only when the royal family is busy fighting the other nobles, and the defenses of the castle are focused on the outside, would we get the chance to sneak inside. We didn't count on a simultaneous invasion by the icy abomination at the same time, which only helped our chances even more. But we still don't have much time, as we have reports that elven ships are already on their way here. We absolutely cannot risk staying too long, and are supposed to escape the planet today. What are these abominations? I've heard them mentioned multiple times already. Again, I don't know too many details. What I can say is that their existence is very unusual, and that they did not exist on this planet even just a year ago. All I know is that they seem to be made of ice, and that they naturally hate everything to do with heat. Frygles, as descendants of a dragon, have extremely hot blood and so are frequently targeted by them. But my original impression was that these monsters have no intelligence, yet the act of laying siege to a castle does not fall in line with that belief. There may be something more going on. Lex pondered for a moment about what to do. All the signs pointed to the fact that the treasure he was looking for was right here, and was most likely the one infected with the dragon's obsession. But he was not immune to its spirit pull ability, and had constantly fallen prey to distractions. While such a thing was not inherently dangerous, it did pose some risks. Somehow, the dragon had mysteriously died, but that did not reduce the danger in Lex's eyes. If anything, the danger had only increased, for he could not imagine what could so silently and secretly kill a dragon. Moreover, there were some mysterious enemies targeting the Frygles, and possibly the dragon as well, not to mention the elves on their way to this planet. After some consideration, he concluded that while there was danger, it was not enough to deter him. Having made up his mind, he threw a golden key towards Terrell. If things get desperate and you really need medical attention, crush that key. You'll be fine, he said, already walking away. He wondered what awaited him behind the massive door. Was that the entrance to the dragon's treasures? That would be too easy, right? As it turned out, behind the doors what awaited Lex really was the dragon's treasure hoard or the very beginning of it. Mountains of gold were piled randomly on the floor, though there seemed to be a walkway between the endless coins, nuggets, raw ore and massive bricks, leading somewhere deeper. Curious, Lex picked up some of the gold and discovered this was far different from the gold he was used to seeing on Earth. A quick scan from his fancy monocle revealed over 216 different types of gold, In the universe, gold was valuable as well, though not because it could be used to make jewelry. No, the value of gold came from the fact that it was a phenomenal conductor for spirit energy, and each different type of gold before him had a few different traits or uses. Lex looked at the mountain of gold on his right, then at the one on his left, then he scratched his head. "Mary, how can I teleport things directly to the inn?" he asked, knowing that the system would never give him an easy time. If he had to put everything in his bangle and then teleport to the inn to drop it off every time, he would be here for a while. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 762 Spirit Pull. Well, you can send workers from the inn to the connected planets now. You can send some over and hope they teleport somewhere nearby, after which you can have them come here and collect it, Mary replied sheepishly, knowing that that wasn't the answer Lex was looking for. Lex thought of various answers on his own. The most ideal citation would be if he could connect to the inn like he connects to his spatial treasure. That he could teleport anything he wanted directly to the inn. But that wasn't possible, whether because it was actually impossible or because the system did not want to cooperate with Lex. The next best option was to get the most massive spatial treasure possible. This was actually quite hard, as he already had some of the largest spatial treasures available, whether it was his bangle or the container for Silent Wanderer. He could place an order at the Emporium for an even larger one, but that would surely take a lot of time, not to mention be very expensive on its own as well. Ironically, the liquidity he would need to pay for such a treasure seemed to be right in front of him, but it was out of reach because Lex lacked exactly such a treasure. He shook his head and made a decision. Although he was a greedy capitalist who would never say no to money, especially free money, he was not blind to what was actually precious. Once, just to sate his aching heart, he filled his bangle with gold, teleported to the inn, deposited it and then returned, but then he did not continue to do so. He had barely taken a drop from the hoard, and transporting all of it would surely take ages. Chances were that the treasures he would encounter deeper in were much more valuable than these mountains of gold right at the start. With one last wistful glance to satisfy himself, Lex walked forward on the winding path through the mountains of gold all around him. After the first couple of mountains, Lex encountered glowing gems buried within the gold, illuminating the hoard. Eventually, Lex started to jog as it was taking too long to navigate around the mountains. He was also concerned about the fact that although the dwarfs had entered only a few minutes before him, he could not find any trace of them at all. Every now and then, Lex would once again get lost in thoughts, but with Mary checking up on him constantly, he kept waking up. Finally, the trail reached a descending staircase, and so Lex entered the second layer of the treasure hoard. Contrary to what Lex was expecting, the next layer actually consisted of a large garden. There were hundreds of thousands of fairies flying around, tending to countless flowers and plants. Instantly, Lex was able to tell that these were both very valuable, and also very toxic. Holding his breath, Lex rushed through this room as well, completely undisturbed by the fairies. In fact, they seemed to not even sense his existence as they carried on with their tasks in unusual silence, though admittedly, a reason they might not have detected him was his suit as well. The garden was well lit, showing a new pattern of illuminated chambers, contrary to the rest of the planet, which was completely dark. The plants also did not seem to mind the increasing heat, which by now was causing Lex to sweat visibly. He was very grateful that his suit would not suffer from any sweat stains. After finding another staircase, Lex descended to the third level. This level looked more like a museum than a hoard or collection. There were countless stages or pedestals built on both sides of the path, with each containing items or treasures. Although Lex wanted to ignore these as well, since he could not identify most of them even with his lenses, he was forced to stop by an overwhelming attraction his body felt towards a particular vial containing a dark purple liquid. Lex almost lost control of his own body, so strong was the attraction. But, ultimately, he managed to control himself. He only placed the vial in his spatial ring and didn't immediately drink it like he wanted. The strangest thing was how each of these treasures were so easily accessible, with no formation or protective glass even. To try it out, he randomly picked up a sword and a shield that was also placed nearby and encountered no obstruction at all. Speaking of which, he wondered what that sword and shield were made of. To be a part of a dragon's collection, they must be valuable. Were they incredibly strong, or did they perhaps only have collector's value? Did dragons care about such things? What if? Lex, it's been a couple of minutes, you all right? Mary asked, suddenly waking him from his stupor. Yeah, thanks, I'm fine. He had only begun to say when he realized that he did not recognize his surroundings at all. Although he was still in the horde, as he could tell by the countless spirit stones and fountain of spirit water, he had long passed the stages and podiums. Lex! Lex! Wake up! Mary's voice suddenly woke Lex from yet another stupor, and he immediately realized his surroundings were different once again. Fear gripped his heart as he suddenly realized he was losing track of time. Maybe he should return to the inn. Speaking of the inn, Lex had had a dragon there as well. Would it have had the same effect if the system hadn't been suppressing the harmful effects of its aura? Despite his best efforts, Lex completely lost himself to the influence of the spirit pull, and walked through the massive dragon's horde like a zombie. Mary, who had noticed his strangeness, had been yelling at him for hours, but it stopped working long ago. He did not even notice when he crossed the corpses of a couple of dwarves, nor did he notice when he started walking over a puddle of freshly spilled blood. Chapter 763 Assaulted by a pervert. The horde of a dragon was much vaster than anything Lex had imagined, and he would have been extremely surprised by how deep he descended into the planet were his mind not occupied by random thoughts. Besides the usual gold, jewels, treasures, herbs, and spirit stones, there was also art, music, sculptures, and other entities that Lex lacked the senses to even observe. This particular dragon's favorite part of its horde, however, was at the lowest level, and Lex was about to approach it. Currently, the chamber he was walking through was the second to last, and was the part of the horde where the dragon collected members of various races. Throughout the universe there were countless unique or mystical races who had unparalleled power or unbelievable abilities that made them extremely special as well as valuable. They too were a part of the dragon's collection. Various prisons lined the walls that Lex walked by, most of them made of glass so that the prisoner, or rather the specimen, was visible. Some, however, for extremely unique or unusual races required special prisons that were made from other more protective materials. Though they were all extremely different, currently many of them shared one thing in common: they were extremely weak. They were deprived of spirit energy inside their prison cell, and since the dragon had died many months ago, no one had fed them either. A few of the prisoners had even died. But, one prison cell made out of an unusual gray material even the fancy contact lenses could not identify, had a broken wall. Lex, however, did not notice any of that as he continued to walk. Lex had been extremely confident in his cultivation technique and even himself, which is why he opted to continue the exploration. He was not wrong to be confident, for his defense and self-protection abilities were truly phenomenal. But, ultimately, there was a limit to what they could protect him from. The spirit pull ability, technically, did not harm Lex in any way, which is why his spirit's self-defense failed, although the matter was more complex than just that. In the beginning, his strong mentality allowed him to retain lucidity, but the closer he got to the dragon, the worse it became. Although Lex had numerous times even survived an attack from an Earth immortal, if he were lucid now, he would be able to feel that the aura being radiated from the final chamber was much stronger and deeper than any Earth immortal he had ever met. In fact, it was even greater than Ragnar's, and he was a heaven immortal. So then, how could he, a golden core cultivator, stand a chance? But, since spirit pull was just a passive ability brought about by the strength of the dragon's obsession, and was not purposefully focused on attracting everyone, there was a chance to break free. For example, the various dwarf corpses that Lex had crossed. In their final moments, right before they died, the threat of death had woken them up. But by then, it was much too late. As Lex crossed the final dwarf corpse, which belonged to the leader of the dwarves, he attracted the attention of a massive creature. It had 8 legs, with 4 on each side of its body, much like a scorpion, but that is where the similarity ended. It had a long protruding neck covered in purple scales, a maw filled with rows of teeth dripping with blood and 12 reptilian eyes, each one suddenly focused on Lex. The creature did not have arms or claws, but it did have unusually shaped wings protruding from its back, and the joints in the wings could readjust at a whim, making them dangerous weapons as well. It also had a long, thick tail that it could exert perfect control over. The creature was extremely skinny at the moment, as if it had been starved near to the point of death, and feasting on dwarves did not seem to have done much for it. But Lex's body, his body radiated an aura so attractive that the creature dropped the body it was currently feasting on, and slowly approached him. Unlike the rest, the creature was immune to the effects of spirit pull. In fact, were it near full strength, it would not have wasted even a glance on such pathetic prey. But the dragon had starved this particular creature for years, and so it was at its weakest. It would not die so easily, but at the same time it could not exert all its strength either. Otherwise it would not have hid from the king every time he crossed, and would have preyed on him instead. But it did not matter. Slowly and steadily, the creature would regain its strength. Lightsville.com. After studying Lex thoroughly, and concluding that he was only in the golden core realm, the creature pounced. Like the dwarves, it expected the threat of death to wake him from the effects of spirit pull in the last moment, but oddly enough, that did not happen. The creature did not ponder over what that was and furiously bit at his neck, its teeth digging in. Something odd happened. There was no gush of delicious blood in its mouth, or the taste of flesh. The confusion had barely registered when it felt an otherworldly grip around its neck, nearly causing a fracture in its current frail bones. Its face was forcefully pulled back, and what awaited it was a gaze filled with raging fury. "Were you licking my neck, you creep?" Lex asked between gritted teeth as he struggled to understand what happened. He felt like was just assaulted by a pervert, and the sticky sensation of the creature's saliva on his neck grossed him out so much he finally woke from the effects of the spirit pull. Before the creature could respond, or more likely retaliate, Lex could no longer hold on to his revolution. Still holding on to the creature from its neck, he picked it up and slammed it onto the ground. Chapter 764 Beatdown. So strong was the disgust that Lex felt that there was no indication of spirit pull affecting him at all. Lex was completely focused on completely killing the perverted creature that had. Just thinking about it pissed Lex off even more. He summoned the sword he had recently taken from the dragon's hoard and swung it without hesitation at the creature's necks. Unexpectedly, the sword completely shattered and an unusual aura latched onto Lex before disappearing. Lex was momentarily disappointed, but he did not want to waste too much time on useless things. Much in the way he had quickly improved in hand-to-hand combat, new and inventive ideas came to Lex for how he could possibly kill the perverted creature. Yet before he attacked, Lex quickly changed out of his stealth suit and into his defensive suit. If he had been wearing this from the start, the creature would never have had the opportunity to lick his neck. The creature also recovered from the shock it had received and had retreated from Lex. Fortunately for it, when Lex tried to slash its neck he had to let go, otherwise the creature would forever be stuck in Lex's vice grip. Lex's physical strength was abnormal from the very start, let alone now that his cultivation technique had changed. Yet oddly enough, he had not been able to crush that creature's neck with only one hand. Maybe using 2 hands would get the job done, but just surviving even one hand was a testament to how strong it was. The creature had barely recovered its strength after devouring the blood and soul of a few dwarves, so instead of attacking Lex directly, it used its innate ability and targeted his spirit. It hissed threateningly while it extended its wings, releasing a sonic attack that would disorient Lex, or that's what it had thought. With the weapon failing him, Lex relied on nothing but his good old fist and smashed it into the creature's face. Unexpectedly, the creature didn't lose any teeth in that clash. Lex was surprised by the sturdiness of the creature's body, while the creature was surprised by how ridiculous Lex's strength was. The creature's body was easily multiple times bigger than Lex, yet it was being thrown around like a plaything. A similar scene repeated itself a few more times while the creature tried to retaliate and Lex tried to pummel it. Neither made much progress, though admittedly Lex was venting a little by beating the creature up. Finally, the creature became fed up and used one more of its racial traits, though the cost of this was quite heavy. The creature, who had gained a momentary respite from Lex's beatings, began to turn illusory, as if it was fading from existence. Lex did not want to give it the opportunity to escape, so he attacked again, but his fists went right through the creature, as if it were just a mirage. Despite the situation, the creature could not resist showing Lex a smug look, though of course Lex could not decipher its facial features. The creature had an unusual affinity for spirituality, and so could convert its physical form into one akin to spirituality. In simple words, it could literally turn itself into a thought. But the smug look on its face froze when Lex tried to grab onto it, and this time succeeded. The effects of impervious hands were truly many-fold, and beyond what Lex even knew. He had no idea that he was physically holding on to an idea at the moment, nor did he care. He just wished to slap the creature, so he did. No, wait, stop, the creature, still with fresh blood tainting its teeth, began to cry. We're not enemies. That earlier was just a misunderstanding. The creature tried to plead with Lex, but he adhered to a strict no association with perverts rule, so he was not interested in talking to it, and smashed his knee into its face. But no matter how Lex beat it up, the creature did not even bleed. The creature could also similarly not even get past the defense of his clothes, let alone once again try to bite his flesh. The fight, thus, seemed to be going nowhere. I can help you, the creature pleaded. I know the dragon's secrets. I know where it hides its treasures. We're inside its treasure hoard, idiot. Lex finally spoke, and kicked it again. No matter what, he did not let go of the creature, for he had a strong feeling that if it disappeared, he would not get his hands on it again. If physical attacks didn't work, he would try soul attacks. No, that's not. I know how the dragon died. I have its secrets. Please, just stop. Although Lex was not hurting it, his attack still caused its current weak body pain. Moreover, as he got ready to use evisceration, a subtle premonition of danger filled the creature's mind, making it even more desperate. Luckily for it, it finally said something Lex was interested in. How would you know how the dragon died? If you were nearby, how did you survive when the dragon did not? I have a very special ability. I can tap into the energy released by others' thoughts around me. Although I was trapped in the prison cell, I could still read some of the dragon's passive thoughts from time to time. It was the only entertainment I had, so I always did my best. Lex narrowed his eyes as he wondered whether to give the creature a chance. It was most likely lying, but on the off chance that it wasn't. How did the dragon die? You better tell me everything, or trust me, I will make you join the dragon. It all started a few months ago. A strange golden light filled the entire planet, even inside my cell. Later, I learned from the dragon that the same light seemed to have appeared around the entire realm, and that it was filled with mysterious laws it had never felt before. Unfortunately for it, that light was a lot more mysterious than even the dragon realized. Chapter 765 Screaming. Although Lex had been preoccupied by his own cultivation at the time, he had long since learned of the phenomena that had taken place during his breakthrough to the Golden Core realm. He was informed of the golden hue within the inn by Mary, and later on he had heard various guests talk about the hue in their respective planets as well. It was also the subject of many conspiracy theories on the Henali portal, which is why Lex found it hard to forget the golden hue caused by his breakthrough. He could not fathom why his breakthrough had caused the hue, nor why its effects were so grand and widespread. The hue had even caused countless new religions to sprout across the entire realm, as races with limited scope of knowledge or understanding took it to be a sign from a deity. That had somehow sped up the collection of divine energy for his wish by the system, but it was still below 10% filled to grant him his wish, so Lex never thought of it. Now, once again, he was brought face to face with yet another repercussion of the phenomena of his breakthrough. Studying the strange light allowed the dragon to have a few breakthroughs, so it went into closed-door cultivation. For immortals, the chance for a breakthrough may come only once a million years, so once it comes, they can forsake everything to pursue it. But what it didn't know was that the golden hue allowed him to see hope for a breakthrough, but it also woke up a primordial being who had been asleep. The creature trembled as it recalled the being it had seen. As it was able to read some of the thoughts of any being close to it, the creature had glimpsed into the mind of that thing. I'm not too clear on the specifics, but I was able to read some of the being's thoughts while it was waking up. It had been trapped inside a crystal that the dragon had in its treasure. Outwardly, the crystal looked no different from any other spirit crystal, but contained within was an entity perhaps as old as this realm itself. It took a few months for the entity to wake up, but once it did, the creature trembled once again. I don't know what happened exactly, but the creature did something to the dragon, and I felt its thoughts completely die, yet for some reason the body is still alive. Then the creature disappeared, and I haven't felt its thoughts since. It probably left a long time ago. With the dragon dead, I could finally try to escape. I have no other intentions. I just want to recover enough energy to escape this planet. The creature was clearly lying about its purpose, but as far as Lex could tell using his sixth sense, it seemed to be telling the truth about the dragon and the thing that killed it. Of course, there was no way of knowing for sure. While Lex was still lucid, he looked around and saw the various corpses on the ground. The creature had not eaten their bodies. It had merely bit into their flesh before eating something else. Lex had a strong feeling that the creature had fed on their spirituality. Just as Lex was evaluating what the creature had told it, he felt something strange and the creature disappeared, even from within his grip. Lex was genuinely surprised, for this was the first time something had managed to escape the grip of his impervious hands, but it did not seem to have gone away. This was because a feeling of extreme danger surrounded Lex, even causing the hair on his body to stand on end. He immediately extended his spirit and soul sense, but to no avail. Ah! Lex could not help but scream as he fell to the ground on his knees as a mind-rending pain filled his head. He felt like something had attacked his very consciousness, as if it was a physical entity to be touched. Normally, that would just be a metaphor, but in Lex's case, due to his strange physique, that was an actual fact. Gritting his teeth, Lex entered the berserk state and pushed this unusual ability to the limit of what he could endure. In essence, the berserk state was a state that drove his emotions to extremes beyond normal while simultaneously strengthening Lex's physical strength. It did this by feeding on the extreme emotions. Normally, this was an excellent ability to wreak havoc when a lot of brute force was required and little brainpower, for the extreme emotions made it difficult to think too deeply. At the moment, however, Lex was using it to strengthen his body, and thereby his spirituality, while at the same time making his mind chaotic with extreme emotions. A shrill scream filled the hall they were in, and the creature fell to the ground appearing in front of Lex, as if it had emerged from his body. I knew you were a pervert. Lex roared, and lost all notion of holding back and gathering any information. This creature was too strange, not to mention dangerous. Swinging his fist like a divine hammer, Lex smashed the creature with all his strength, giving it little time to respond. At the same time, Lex launched evisceration, tearing into the creature's soul. The creature screamed, and disappeared again. The reason Lex had not held on to this time was because he had clearly learned that the creature had entered his mind somehow, because he was in contact with it. If they weren't touching, maybe it would be harder for it to enter his mind, but that did not seem to be the case. Lex suffered another rip in his thoughts, although the pain seemed to only elevate his extreme emotions. Since this creature was sensitive to his thoughts, he wondered if it would be affected by them too. Immediately he thought of the deep aura he had felt when he tried to sit in on a meeting of Tao Lords. As the memory flashed through his mind, Lex suddenly became dizzy and weak. The creature, however, screamed much louder than before. Chapter 766, Mind Meld. The creature's scream reverberated across just as it fell out of Lex's body once again. But this time, that was not all. The creature started writhing on the ground like a poisoned insect. It used its own wings to beat its own body while its 8 legs curled up and dug into its own flesh. Lex was not able to take advantage of the situation immediately, as he himself was recovering from his sudden weakness and fatigue. Fortunately, he had only recalled that meeting for a moment instead of dwelling on it, or he might have once again succumbed to just the memory of it. When he came to, he saw that the creature he had been unable to harm at all lay on the ground covered in its own blood, though it wasn't dead yet. Lex had been forcibly brought out of his berserk state by the mere memory of that meeting, which is why he retained the sense to not rush over and attack immediately. But that did not mean he gave up. Physical attacks weren't working, and though evisceration hurt the creature, it wasn't doing significant damage. It was at this moment he was really regretting not having a strong attack that used his spirit sense, for he had a feeling that such attacks would be most effective. But instead of lamenting what he lacked, Lex focused on what he had. Lex entered his flow state, and focused on his spatial affinity. Although he was not a master of it yet, he had teleported enough to learn tidbits about his affinity since he got it. Moreover, his increased analytical skills made it so that Lex could learn new skills much faster than before. Lightsville.c Omicron M. The easiest thing to do would be to manipulate space to somehow cut the creature into pieces, and that's exactly what Lex tried to do. Unfortunately, creating a blade out of morphed space was not exactly easy, let alone anything else. Lex did, however, manage to warp space a little exactly where the creature was, causing it to suffer immense pain, waking it from its stupor finally. All of its eyes focused on Lex with a newfound viscousness, as the creature tried to disappear once again. But that was easier said than done. Lex kept manipulating space within the creature's body, trying to tear space open, or use space to tear the creature open. Either one would do, though all he effectively managed to do was torture it. Wait, I'm sorry. I know the dragon's secrets. I can tell you, the creature pleaded, but Lex was no longer going to fall for such basic tricks. Although he longed for the satisfaction of beating the creature up with his own hands, he had to rely on spatial affinity. He could also come up with arrays to harm the creature, but somehow he felt like he couldn't make arrays strong enough to do that. Theoretically, arrays could achieve the strongest power level the universe could support, since the universe itself powered arrays. Practically speaking, Lex had hit a bottleneck when it came to his arrays. Maybe his way of making them was obsolete or faulty, or maybe he didn't know enough significantly strong characters. Either way, his arrays seemed to be limited to the nascent level in terms of power for the moment. Lex Williams, don't push me too far, the creature roared as it tried to get up. But its efforts were in vain as its legs were too weak at the moment. The creature had clearly read through some of Lex's memories, which chilled Lex's heart. He absolutely could not afford to let the creature live now. Since keeping a distance clearly didn't help, Lex leaped forward and immediately put its head in a lock and placed his right hand on the creature's forehead. His intention was to scramble the thing's brain. As if sensing Lex's intention, the creature roared angrily and resisted Lex, but in terms of physical strength, it was clearly below Lex. At the same time, it tried to use its ability to disappear once again, but clearly it was too hurt to do so. It seemed the memory of that meeting had hurt it a lot more than Lex expected. They struggled for a few dozen minutes before Lex suddenly succeeded in causing a tiny tear in space, within the creature's skull. The creature died instantly, and Lex actually tripped because it had stopped resisting his strength so suddenly. Lex groaned, feeling exhausted, but did not delay at all. He immediately stored the creature's body within his spatial ring and began teleporting back to the inn. He could not risk becoming a victim to spirit pull again. Yet the next moment, the sound of a notification distracted him. New notification, system feature murderer activated. Immediately he felt the change, as he was reminded of the feature he had unlocked so long ago, yet for some reason never triggered. Murderer. Every time the host kills someone stronger than them outside of system grounds, the host can learn one of the victim's abilities/techniques. The ability had finally been triggered, and Lex could tell that the system was transferring some information directly into his brain. He had not suddenly unlocked a new ability, but the method to replicate the effects of the creature's ability using spiritual energy was fed into Lex's memories. The ability was one of the most bizarre abilities Lex had ever encountered. It allowed Lex to turn his body into a thought and enter someone's spirituality. What did that entail, and what he could do once he achieved those details he was not given, but clearly this was far from a simple technique. The next moment, Lex teleported to the inn, finally leaving the horde. The effects of the spirit pull on him disappeared, but Lex had not given up on the horde yet. Since the dwarves had a way to protect themselves from it, the Emporium surely did as well. He put aside thoughts of his newly gained ability, which he aptly named Mind Meld, and teleported over to X14. He had some shopping to do. Chapter 767 Secrets. William, if this lead is real, we won't need to worry about accumulating credit to help you heal at all. We can directly ask the Henali to help you recover to your peak state and still have some credit left over. To be honest, even I am surprised by this outcome. Back then, I acted out on a whim, but who knew it would pay off, said William with a clear look of disbelief on his face. Their three brothers, Batu, Henry, and Nissar, also accompanied them. For them all to gather like this, outside of the Midnight Inn, where they could all teleport to, was a rare occasion and showed how significant this event was. If all went well, they could also gain a few benefits this time. But, more importantly, they had important matters to handle afterwards. The Jotun Empire had decided to move out of the Pendau Galaxy for various reasons, and as the heads of the Empire, they had to ensure that the most important and sensitive secrets of the Empire were either removed or erased before their departure. It's about time one of our descendants did something worthwhile, said Batu. He was the head of the Togolder noble family who managed the Empire's military. Although he and the others had many descendants, and many of them were very powerful and had made many contributions, it was clear that Batu was not satisfied with the results. Their gains and victories were small-scale, relatively speaking, and hardly ever influenced the entire empire. Although such a request might be too much to put on a few descendants, weren't the 5 of them handling the entire empire? They were human too, and in fact had much worse conditions when they were starting out. Yet none of their descendants were qualified to be their equals yet. If being great was so easy, everybody would do it, Nissar said softly. As the head of the Butt family, and in charge of the empire's finances, one would expect him to be more mild-tempered than his brother. In fact, that was far from the truth. Although he looked of mild and tepid nature, Nissar had more blood on his hands than any of the other brothers. He could not be blamed either, after all, wealth begets greed, and he had the wealth of several galaxies under his control. Before their conversation could continue, they finally reached their destination, and entered a room covered in isolation formations. Inside, a beast seemed to be waiting for them. Upon their arrival, the beast confirmed their identities before crushing a small trinket and disappearing. None of the brothers found this odd, and waited patiently. A few moments later, another person teleported into the room. Belle looked extremely pale and weak, in spite of the fact that she had been getting treatment for the past few weeks. Her eyes, however, burned with the same ever-present ferocity that she normally exuded. She looked at the 5 men in the room and recognized them all. Her direct ancestor, William, was the one she was supposed to meet, but she did not mind that he had brought along a few extra people. After all, they were the big shots of the Empire. She looked at William, already used to the fact that he looked identical to her brother. She had never commented on it nor mentioned it, because it was completely irrelevant. Looking like your ancestors was quite a common occurrence actually, especially among cultivators who could live long enough to actually meet their prior generations. Hiding in Ventura to erase all your traces, a remarkable plan, William said, feeling extremely pleased with Belle. I only hope your efforts were worth it. As soon as we can confirm the veracity of your information, we can hand it over to the relevant people. You don't need to worry, your reward won't go to anyone else besides you. You can confirm it however you like, she said without any hint of deference. Nor am I worried about anyone stealing my rewards. After all, without me, no one will be able to follow the lead. I had to use my bloodline ability to mark Jeffrey's ship before it escaped into a wormhole. Only after the effects of my bloodline overdraft disappear, and I can use it again, will I be able to trace it. Lightsville.C Omicron M. William was already used to Belle's attitude, and the others didn't care too much either. Let me speed up your recovery, Jotun said as he reached out to her, but the moment he placed a hand on her shoulder he frowned, and withdrew his hand. His brothers all turned to look, and saw a single drop of blood escape his index finger before the pinprick on his finger disappeared. Surprise and shock filled their eyes as a storm brewed in their hearts. Jotun was the strongest human in the realm, and in the highest realm that the origin realm would normally allow, the celestial realm. It was not an exaggeration to state that 1,000,000 galaxies would not be able to produce a single expert on the same level as Jotun, so powerful was he. Yet now, he had actually bled. There are unusual inscriptions in your body, Jotun said, his voice filled with confusion. Yeah, my old man placed them there, Belle responded evenly. Your father? How is that possible? The sword intent used to carve those inscriptions even harmed me. This time, the most shocked was not Jotun, but William. His descendant was so powerful, so why had he never heard of him? My old man has too many secrets. My mother, she has even more. Last I saw my father, he was merely in the nascent realm, but even I dared not mess with him. His sword intent, no, his sword Tao is too powerful. He's a bona fide freak. She took a deep breath, and before anyone could ask anything, spoke again. Don't bother asking any questions. The answer will most likely be that I don't know, and besides, I'm not here to talk about my family. Contact whoever you need to contact, and let's get this show on the road. I've already wasted too much time recovering from my overdraft. No need, spoke a deafening voice in all their minds, and a figure appeared in the room alongside them. Hiding in Ventura to erase your traces was smart, but the moment you returned, so did your karma. Any Tao Lord still looking for traces of the terrorists would easily find you. Before Jotun, or anyone else, could do anything, the figure disappeared alongside Belle. Jotun paled, and immediately contacted the Henali. He could only hope that the figure that appeared was working for them, or else they might not only have lost the lead to Jeffrey, the mystery surrounding the mysterious swordsman would also remain unsolved. While he did that, William once again retrieved the files and his family related to Belle and her immediate family. Perhaps it was time to pay closer attention to this group. Chapter 768 Tax Refund. On a remote planet, devoid of all life, a swordsman was sitting cross-legged with a normal-looking double-sided sword on his lap. The area where the man sat was completely black, as if the surface of the planet had been charred by a strong flame, yet the char did not rub off on his clothes. The sound of thunder rumbled in the sky above him, causing the cultivator to open up his eyes and look up. His lightning tribulation was finally coming, though that did not seem to elicit any emotion from the man. All the oracles, fortune-tellers, and prophets in the market seemed to have disappeared, said a woman reading from a file. Though she was quite a distance away from him, her voice carried as if she was right beside him. I told you, we should stop relying on them, the man calmly replied as he stood up. Well, excuse me for trying. One of my daughters, and my son have disappeared, and I have no other way to look for them. What do you want me to do? Put your shoes on, it's almost time, the man said looking up. The woman grumbled, but she listened to the man and quickly put on her shoes that she had taken off while she rested. The man seemed cavalier and uninterested in the fate of his children, but it was only because he could sense that they were still all alive. While the two were chatting, the man's lightning tribulation began, yet the lightning did not have time to fall. As soon as it formed, a sword slash filled with incredibly sharp sword intent cut the skies open, revealing an unknown space. The man and the woman quickly jumped through the opening, leaving the planet for some unknown destination. Silence filled the room as Lex and Powell stood face to face. They were staring each other in the eyes, neither willing to back off. A silent tension began to build as the seconds passed by as neither said anything, though they both knew the value of each second surpassed that of an entire spirit stone mine. Tick. One spirit stone mine. Tock. Another spirit stone mine. Tick-tock. Two more mines, and each second that passed by like this, they were losing out on mines like this. Finally, Powell could no longer contain himself and opened his mouth, but the door behind him swung open and another Powell walked out. For some reason, Lex knew that he was once again face to face with the original Powell. Are you serious? You have unlimited access to a dragon's hoard? Yes, but I cannot say for how long. You can decide whether you want to suffer a loss by wasting time negotiating, or you want to minimize your losses and just give me what I want. Are you willing to sign a soul contract? The only stipulation will be that inside the hoard you will look for a very specific treasure for me and do your best to get it without having to suffer mortal danger. If there's too much danger, you can stop, or if you don't find it, then it's my loss. But if you do find it, you have to hand it over. In exchange, I'll give you the best protection we have against spirit pull, and the largest spatial treasure we have available. Both will be free, as long as you sign the soul contract. Lightsville.com. Lex raised an eyebrow, but did not give his emotions away in any other way. Let me see the contract. You should also tell me what the treasure is, and where it might be. Every second I waste, someone else could be closing in. It's called Peronian jade. I'll give you a compass that looks for it, and a special container for it as well. The jade has no harmful qualities, so you don't need to worry about anything, but you have to give every bit of it you find. It'll be a part of the contract. He pondered for a moment, but had no recollection of the item. Although it was no doubt going to be extremely valuable, Lex would be getting sufficient gains in exchange. He examined the soul contract, but found no tampering, or any other conditions, besides the one Powell stated. He didn't like having to sign a soul contract, but considering he would be getting two extremely valuable treasures in exchange, Lex suppressed his discomfort. Fine, I'll sign it, he said. But first, I want to see what you'll be giving me. Powell nodded, and brought out two items. One was a large drum that could be worn on one's back. It was not exactly inconspicuous, but it contained 1 mile square of area inside it. Unfortunately, that was still too small compared to the dragon hoard, but it was big enough for now. The second item was a crown that looked quite flimsy. In fact, Lex was slightly concerned he might break it by just picking it up, but Powell assured him that that was the best tool they had to protect him from spirit pull. Not wanting to waste any time, Lex signed the contract using his finger as the pen and spirit energy as the ink. As soon as he signed it, he felt an uncomfortable sensation in his body. It was something he could ignore, but at the same time it was mildly suffocating, as if he wore a tie too tightly. Powell also handed him a thin, black piece of jade, which was the compass that would point him towards Peronian jade. With everything in order, Lex promptly left the shop, and then teleported to the inn, then back to the hoard. Barely a couple of minutes had passed, but Lex's situation was completely different, hopefully. He put on the flimsy crown and tested to see if his thoughts still drifted. Nearly 30 seconds later, Lex finally concluded that he was safe, as he was able to retain his lucidity throughout. The capitalist in Lex was finally set free, and he grinned like a madman as he descended to the bottom-most floor of the hoard. Getting free money and treasure felt even better than collecting tax refunds. Chapter 769 Disbelief. Before rushing down to the last floor, where he strongly suspected he would be faced with the dragon, or what remained of it, Lex took out the black jade piece that Powell had given him. If the Peronian jade existed, the compass would find it. In all honesty, Lex did not mind doing the man this favor. He only wished that he could have kept a small piece of jade so as to study what was so special about it. There was a strong possibility that the jade was just an item he needed to sell to another client, but regardless, the overwhelmingly favorable deal that Lex had gotten made him curious. As soon as he summoned the jade, it vibrated and an arrow appeared pointing down. There indeed was Peronian jade, and it was at the lowest level of the horde. Lex subtly nodded, as if such a thing only made sense. He put the jade away, but before he could depart, his ever-present, ever-reliable holographic assistant spoke up. "Hey Lex, do you think you could do me a favor?" she asked, her voice tinged with shyness and awkwardness. It was apparent that she was feeling very uncomfortable about the request she wanted to make. "How can I help?" Lex asked, though he suspected he knew what was coming. "Would it be possible for you to find me a very special item present in the horde? It can help me make a body." "A body?" Lex repeated, genuinely surprised although he anticipated a request might be coming his way. "For you to get a body, wouldn't it have to be given to you by the system?" "Yes, technically that is the proper way of doing things. But you are well aware of loopholes in the system rules, and this is one of them. If I make my own body, instead of getting one from the system, I'll have much fewer restrictions on me than usual. I'll be able to answer all your questions that your insufficient authority prevents me from informing you. What do you need?" In case the dragon down below has a child, or is about to have a child, he may have prepared a special blood altar in its private chamber to nourish the egg. If that's the case, there will be a scale inside the altar. "I need that scale." "I'll keep an eye out," Lex said, before continuing down. He did not question Mary at the moment about why she knew what a dragon might do to nurture its child, or about her desire to get a body. He felt like he wouldn't get a proper answer, and even if he did, he was currently on a time crunch, so now was not the time. He had taken a look at the floor he was in for anything valuable he might find, but this floor seemed to have nothing besides prisons holding various races and the dwarfs' corpses. Neither interested Lex at the moment, so he decisively left. A few minutes after Lex left, one of the dwarf corpses moved and picked itself up. The leader, Barley, seemed to be recovering from death itself, though he did not seem concerned with that. Instead, his gaze seemed fixed on the staircase leading down below. "Lex William," he murmured to himself as his strength slowly recovered. He seemed to have heard the name when the creature had yelled it out earlier. Lex, who was descending the stairs, paused for a moment and turned around. His senses were extremely sharp and detected some kind of sound, although he was not sure what it was. A sense of urgency filled his heart. The first dwarf that Lex had seen, Terrell, had mentioned that elves were on their way, for news of the dragon's demise had already spread. Others could also be arriving even as he waited, descended. No longer holding back, Lex began to rush to the bottom of the stairs, though he did not drop his guard. If there was one strange creature here, there could be more. Moreover, the king was supposed to be here somewhere, though the fact that the sounds of Lex's fight had not attracted him was unusual. Lex wiped sweat off his brow one more time as he neared the entrance to the final chamber. By now, not only were the effects of dragons might causing Lex minor problems, but the heat was also causing him to sweat non-stop. If he failed to wipe his brow, whether by hand or spirit sense, the sweat would get into his eyes, making it hard for him to see. When he finally reached the last step, he had already entered the final chamber. There was no door or barrier, and the entrance appeared instantly even if it could not be seen earlier. The moment Lex entered, his knees buckled and he crashed into the ground with full force, causing the ground to tremble. He had not been dropped just to his knees, but his chest had also been pushed down to the ground, his face smacking the floor. He had not been attacked by anyone. Instead, the moment he entered the chamber, he was hit by the full force of the dragon's might. Irrespective of his unwavering pride, and the immense strength packed within his body, when he finally came face to face with the dragon outside of the inn, Lex had been forced into nearly a prostrating state. "What the hell?" he said with gritted teeth as he slowly brought his arms beside himself and pushed himself up. When he was finally able to lift his face off the floor, he looked forward, and suddenly went blank. The sight of the dragon before him was like a clap of thunder in his mind, making him blank and causing him to fall onto the ground once more. When he finally recovered, Lex was struck by endless disbelief. He could not even look at the dragon without suffering, since its aura was completely unrestrained. It was only now that he was beginning to understand how massive a role the played in neutralizing the effects of Cultivator's natural aura. If it were any other golden core cultivator instead of him, they may have already been seriously injured or even died. Chapter 770. In his bones. A small pool of sweat formed on the ground around Lex, though it did not last long as it began boiling shortly after. The scorching heat of the stone floor did not bother Lex nearly as much as the shock of what he was suffering. He knew there was a difference, there had to be one. But for him, who cultivated the most mysterious and powerful technique in the universe, to not be able to even stand in the presence of a dead dragon was astounding. Well, to be fair, Lex was merely in the golden core realm, while the dragon was definitely stronger than the earth immortal realm. That meant that it was at least a heaven immortal, if not a celestial immortal. That was a difference of at least 3 or 4 major realms. Lex closed his eyes and took a few deep breaths, calming himself down. He had to collect himself and figure out a way to resist the dragon's might. He somewhat understood why he was taken by surprise by the sudden increase in the power of the might. The deepest chamber must have special barriers to prevent the aura from going out, or else Lex expected the entire planet might suffer due to it. But none of that mattered right now. He had to overcome this, and not just because all his looting depended on it. Lex's ego, or more accurately, his new sense of self would not allow him to just let things go the way they were. He firmly believed that while he had much of his success because of the system and his technique, he considered himself and his persistence and skill the defining factor for his success. He did not mind the fact that he was pushed down, although that wasn't pleasant either. But he absolutely could not allow himself to remain groveling on the ground. When Lex reopened his eyes, a fire seemed to be lit within them, and once again he picked himself up. This time, he kept his gaze focused on the ground as he lifted himself, feeling each muscle and nerve aching as he pushed himself to the limit. Neither hardened nor impervious hand or any other technique seemed to help at this moment, as the force pushing him down could not be so simply blocked. It was a result of the natural hierarchy of beings. It was the appropriate reaction shown by a being at the bottom of the cosmic ascendance spectrum towards a being at the top. Lex circulated his spiritual energy as fast as he could, fueling his aching body, but that did not lessen the trembling in his hands. Suddenly, Lex understood what it must have felt like for the dwarf when its bones broke under the weight of the dragon's might, because he could hear the bones in his hands cracking. But nothing, not the immeasurable weight pushing him down, not the failure of his techniques to help, not the pain that seemed to transcend his physical body and pierce his very soul, and not the voice screaming inside his heart to just give up and teleport back to the inn could stop Lex. After an excruciatingly long time, Lex managed to pick himself up, into a crawling position. On his hands and knees, Lex gasped for air as if he had done the most intense exercise of his life. There were aches in his body in places he didn't even know existed, or could hurt. Compared to the mighty beings of the universe, he was truly not but a pitiful ant, if that. As countless negative thoughts assaulted his mind, making his confidence waver and weakening his resolve, he could not help but remember one of his earlier musings. He wondered what aura was, and where it came from. Lex believed his own state of mind affected it, but so did his actions. He had developed a powerful aura without even realizing it, influenced by his time as the Innkeeper. He wondered if, now that almost every advantage his system and his technique had given him seemed to be stripped away, he continued to perform incredible feats, how that would affect his aura. After all, previously he only believed he would have been incredible even without his advantages. Now he had the opportunity to prove it. Gritting his teeth and strengthening his resolve, Lex lifted his neck and looked forward. There, dominating his vision, was a massive golden-brown beast that seemed larger than life. All measurements seemed to fail as in his eyes, the dragon seemed the largest thing he had ever seen. No mountain, no planet, no star could compare to the enormity that was this beast before him. The dragon was resting on all 4 of its legs, its wings neatly folded over its back. Its tail seemed to coil neatly on the floor beside it, as if it was resting. If one paid attention, they could see its chest rise and fall, indicating that it was breathing softly as if asleep. Yet contradictory to that very observation, the dragon's massive yellow eyes seemed to be open, and for some reason, seemed to be focusing solely on Lex. He could not use his spirit or soul sense, and his instincts seemed to be failing right now as well. Still, somehow, he knew that the dragon's body was alive, but its soul was already dead. What sat in front of him was a living corpse, in a way. Thunder rumbled in Lex's might and his consciousness itself seemed under attack, for the sight itself of the dragon was too noble for him, let alone the fact that they were making eye contact. Tears of blood began to leak out of Lex's nose, giving the world a red tinge, yet Lex did not blink. Instead, he focused on a soft, elevated groove on the dragon's forehead. There seemed to be something there, though Lex could not see it properly from this distance. But he didn't care exactly what it was. He saw that spot and something deep inside of him seemed to wake up. An urge to resist, to rebel, to bite and claw against whatever crap list told him his place was below the dragon seemed to swell in his heart. At first, that voice was small and barely audible against the cacophony of voices in his heart telling him to retreat to the inn and take it easy. But the longer he stared at the dragon, the stronger the voice grew. His tears of blood dripped off his face and mixed with the pool of boiling sweat below him, only to sizzle as well and fill the air with an acrid smell. But that unpleasant smell seemed to reinvigorate Lex. It was the smell of pain, of fighting, of resistance. The voice in his heart, the smell in the air, the ache in his bones, the unwillingness in his soul all joined together to form an unstoppable force that slowly filled every fiber of Lex's being. His gaze still locked on the dragon's forehead, Lex continued his effort to stand up straight. His stupid back had bent down, but he would not leave it like that. Chapter 771 One Step. Outside the castle-cum-mountain range, the war was still ongoing, although a few minor details had changed. Instead of the many nobles working together to fight against the forces of the royal family, they were now all fighting together as brothers in arms and members of the same race, all against the icy abominations that had so suddenly appeared. They were surrounded, and though the situation had not become dire yet, anything could happen at any time. No one understood where these abominations came from, but they understood well what their obsession with the castle was. These things hated heat, and hated the Frigals who had immense heat inside their bodies. But the greatest source of heat on the entire planet was on the last floor of the dragon's hoard in the castle behind them, and that was attracting the abominations from across the planet. Of course, none of them felt for even a second that the creatures could succeed in extinguishing the heat source, but even if they wanted to passively let them go by, the creatures would not permit it. After all, even if their bodies had less heat compared to their main target, they could not be ignored. Just as the battle was reaching its pinnacle, the sound of hundreds of rockets seemed to fill the air. Though Frigals could not see, they used other senses to detect that the sounds were not rockets, but countless ships entering the planet's atmosphere from orbit. They were all aiming for the castle. But they made one miscalculation in their plans to bypass the battle on the ground and directly enter the castle. The abominations were called as such because they had no fixed shape or identity. The only thing that was fixed was that they seemed to have bodies made of ice. That meant that all they needed to do was alter their bodies to take flight. With hundreds of new massive heat sources appearing to aggravate them, the abominations let out howls of fury before they took flight. There were two battlefields now, one in the air and one on the ground. Although motivation, passion, and dedication all burned within his heart, standing up was easier said than done. Willpower was one thing, but accomplishing something seemingly impossible required more than something as ethereal as thoughts and prayers. He needed something more. He hesitated for only a mere second before he made a decision. He could either rely on arrays, a few of which could somewhat help him. Or, he could use his current situation to run his cultivation technique. Unfortunately, he could not run his cultivation technique and use his spirit energy for other tasks at the same time, so he had to choose. Ultimately, the choice was simple. Arrays could provide him immediate but limited relief. The technique, however, had the potential to use his current situation and adapt to it to give him greater benefits. Maybe he could even develop a resistance to dragon's might. There was only one way to find out. With his decision made, he began cultivating while he continued to lift himself up. Lex could not help but release a guttural cry as he pushed himself upright. He felt like he was deadlifting a planet. His cultivation technique was not hampered at all by his movement or the pressure around him, and in fact ran even smoother in these harsh conditions. Slowly, he could tell that it was already bringing about some changes in him, but he could not spare the thought to observe these changes. He had to use every ounce of willpower, and actual power, to move even a few inches. Despite the hardship, the ultimate winner was Lex if one could consider standing up a victory at all. Unfortunately for him, standing up did not give him any release, nor did it make it easier for him. He looked forward and estimated how far the dragon was. Normally this was not an issue, but at the moment the dragon seemed to occupy his entire mind, so it was difficult for him to pay attention to the gap between them. In the end, he gave up. What did it matter anyway? How far could it really be? He tried to drag his foot forward, so as to avoid lifting it, but the friction with the ground was too great. It was not possible. Taking in a deep yet painful breath, he lifted his left foot up and stepped forward. Fuck. Lex cursed as he fell down and lost nearly all his progress. How had walking turned into an impossible task? Lightsville he had put his foot down incorrectly, causing him to stumble. Moreover, the immense pressure and the horrible angle caused something in his left knee to crack. As someone who generally avoided cursing, not at all due to childhood trauma of getting his rear whooped for doing so, the fact that he cursed so loud spoke of his frustration. It was not the bone-crushing pain that caused Lex the frustration as much as knowing that with an injured knee, another hurdle on his already impossible task was added. With clenched fists, he tolerated the pain as he pushed himself back up again. Fortunately, as a cultivator, he was not subject to the same weaknesses he was back when he was a pure mortal. Although his knee was injured, he could use the various muscles in his leg to accommodate his weight as well as forcefully divert the pressure on his knee. Finally, when he pushed himself back up, with unsurpassed focus, Lex once again lifted his leg and took a step. This time he did not mess up, so he was able to divert his weight onto his other leg, and ready himself for his next step. He looked up at the dragon one more time, which was only a few miles away from him, and realized he needed to speed up. If he took 10 minutes on each step, he'd never make it before the others arrived. Suddenly, he felt like cursing again. Chapter 772 Dominance. Lex had been homeschooled a lot, so he did not know what a traditional PE teacher was like. The only thing he had to compare it with was when his dad would put on a tracksuit, grab a whistle and make him and his sisters do odd, random exercises. Sometimes they would run laps around a random park and other times they'd go swimming. Sometimes, his parents would get creative after watching a martial arts movie, like The Karate Kid or something, and then make them do the same things as in the movie. All in all, it was not too bad except for the fact that they would not be allowed to stop till they were thoroughly exhausted and drained. In hindsight, maybe it was just a way for parents to exhaust extremely energetic kids to get some rest themselves. If his parents were normal, that would have made sense. That, however, was irrelevant. What truly mattered was the fact that Lex was having flashbacks to those days of utter exhaustion as he pushed his body beyond its limit to approach the dragon. Each movement, whether it was his hands moving back and forth to maintain balance, or each excruciating part of taking a step, had to be done with the utmost care. It was only under so much extreme pressure that Lex realized how complicated walking actually was. He had to simultaneously cultivate, and though it had not helped him in any way yet, he was confident it would pay off. After all, with each step he took he was closer to the dragon. That also meant that each step he took increased the might of, well, dragon's might. There was a whimpering sound beside him, and Lex could not help but smile. After he had stood up, and regained a dignified stance, he summoned Fenrir. The poor pup was also helpless under the weight of the dragon's oppression, but the aggression buried deep in its bloodline did not allow it to kneel before the dragon. Although it did not have as specific a purpose as Lex, Fenrir too had stood up though it was extremely reluctant to get any closer. Its pride, however, would not allow it to stay back as Lex moved forward. The reason Lex had summoned it was not because Lex did not want to suffer alone, no. It was to temper the pup's will. He had noticed that the more it would hunt, the more it was starting to grow uncontrollably aggressive. It was fine for now, as it always behaved in front of Lex so far, but he thought overcoming a little hardship and realizing that he was not all-powerful might be good for the pup's growth. Also, he needed someone to watch as he overcame this hurdle. What was the point of a performance without an audience? Well, there were plenty of reasons for it actually, but who cared? It had been 30 minutes since Lex began walking, but he had not even covered 500 feet, 150 meters. This was not good because he could sense mild vibrations coming from the castle above. Something was going on, and the longer he took, the greater chances that someone else would show up soon. His brain was filled with countless ideas for how he could make this task easier. He could use his spatial affinity to get closer, he could summon the silent wanderer. Heck, he was certain if he threw a golden key at the dragon hard enough, it would be crushed and send the dragon to the inn. There, he could conduct this trial in as much time as he needed, and that would also save him enough time to loot the rest of the horde. He couldn't help it, Lex had been too focused on searching for loopholes, so all these ideas kept coming to him. But he rejected them all. Some things had to be achieved in the moment, without the thought of retreat or giving up. Sure, he could attempt the same task inside the inn without external pressures hurrying him along, but that would defeat the point. He had to do this to prove he was not reliant on the system. Most of all, he had to conquer the dragon that made him taste the floor. Lex did not even allow himself to enter his flow state, or any other state. This had to be done purely by him. Lex was so focused on the task that he did not notice at all when he started exuding his own aura. It only made sense. He was giving it everything he had, so subconsciously he included his aura in that as well. But while his aura was previously completely suppressed all the way to his skin, under the pressure of dragon's might and driven by the monumental achievement that was each step, it began to change. The direction it was changing was not overwhelmingly oppressive, similar to that of dragon's might, as hospitality was deeply ingrained in him now, and oppressing his guests was never the sign of a good host. But it was gaining authority nonetheless. It was not the authority of a boss over his subordinates, no. It was more like the authority wielded as a result of one's own person. It was like the respect of a warrior, it was the same in a garden just as much as it was on the battlefield. It was like the confidence of a king, they did not need to prove their worth. It was like a celebrity in front of a massive crowd of fans, they did not need to introduce themselves. It was all of that and more, and with each passing second it was being refined further. It was filled with an aura of dominance. Yet how could something that was filled with the air of dominance be suppressed? His aura extended out 1 centimeter from his skin, and for a moment Lex felt the illusion that his step had become easier, even if only a minute amount. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 773 Recording. After Lex took another 100 steps, he developed somewhat of a rhythm. The rhythm helped reduce the strain on his mind, which was focused on even the subtlest movements he made with his body during this time. The hyper-focused state he was in was also one of the reasons he had failed to notice his growing and evolving aura. What he did notice, however, was that while he had expected each progressive step to grow harder, sometimes it would get easier instead. He could not understand why the strain would reduce, and he didn't have the mental capacity to spare to analyze such a thing. Now that the strain on his mind had eased up a little, he could focus on the next thing, which was to speed up. He had to be especially careful with this as he did not want a recurrence of him tripping and injuring himself. His task was already hard enough, without accumulating more injured joints. Lights of a one, almost completely irrelevant, benefit that Lex got from this was that he refined his posture a lot. After all, walking and maintaining balance was a lot easier with proper posture. With his efforts now refocused, his speed began to increase at a steady pace. But so focused was he, not just with his mind and body, but even with his instincts and everything else that he had at his disposal, that Lex began to miss out on other things he would have normally noticed. For example, his cultivation technique finally started producing results. Amazingly, cultivation under such immense pressure sped up his cultivation by over 100-fold. His golden core started to shrink in size, but that was not a bad thing. It was becoming more compressed and therefore only allowed purer and higher quality energy to enter. His body also started to undergo a subtle refinement. It was not that he was gaining more strength, but the elasticity of his muscles was increasing. Moreover, the way his muscles connected to one another and his bones were also subtly changing. This would allow him finer control over his strength and allow his body to tolerate more stress with greater ease. Alongside his sweat, fine black grains of impurities also started to be pushed out of Lex's body. Although Lex had previously undergone cleansings, as he grew in cultivation level and strength, what was considered essential and waste material inside his body also changed. For example, there were certain minerals and nutrients that his body required to strengthen and hold his body together while he built his foundation. But once in the golden core realm, his strength and level had increased so much that those same materials that once held things together now became sources of instability. Of course, that was only relatively speaking, as the body could easily tolerate their negative effects as they were common in all cultivators. But now, due to the immense pressure his body was cultivating under, they were being pushed out, cleansing his body as it grew stronger. Another thing that Lex failed to notice was a figure that appeared in the same hall. It was the dwarf, Barley, and much like Lex, he slammed into the ground. But while Lex recovered and moved on, Barley was already in such a poor state that he could barely tolerate the force. Quickly, or as quickly as he could manage, he dragged himself back out of the hall. But as he sat on the steps, panting and heaving, his sight fell onto Lex. With his back held up straight, he walked at a steady pace with all the seeming ease in the world, despite being under the immense pressure of the dragon. In front of him, the monstrosity that was a dragon stood calmly, his eyes seemingly focused on the approaching figure. Although Barley knew that the dragon was dead, or at least it should be, that is not what it seemed like. From where he sat, it seemed like the dragon was crouching down on the ground, his posture docile and his tail safely curled up, and he dared not move as the tiny figure approached him. It was crazy. It did not make sense. Such a thing was impossible. But the confident gait that Lex had walking forward, his head held up high looking directly at the dragon, his broad strong shoulders that did not seem like they were weighed down by the dragon's might at all combined together to make an image that looked like he had the dragon cowed. Feeling weak, bitter, and unwilling, Barley pulled out a recording device. This was not just a video recorder, as this device would record everything, from the scents, the sounds, the temperature, and even the pressure of the dragon's might, inside of it. This way, when someone reviewed the content later, it would be as if they were there in person. He began recording, and even whispered an introduction. "My name is Barley Holdenson, and I am on the planet Phrygra. My team and I snuck into the great dragon's horde, but this is what we found. I do not know who that person is, but I do know his name is Lex William." The video lacked a full explanation, for example the fact that the dragon in the recording was already dead. But he left it that way on purpose. If he couldn't get the dragon's treasure, at least he'd leave here with a video that will make him an overnight sensation on the Henali portal. He would set a very high price for viewing this recording, and thus set himself up for a lifetime. As for what this Lex might think of his actions, well, with the whole realm knowing that Lex looted a dragon's hoard, he would not live for long. Who cared what he thought? Barley was not being malicious on purpose. He just never even considered things from any other point of view at all. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 774 Obsession. Lex's sweat and blood had long since evaporated, leaving no trace behind. His suit was phenomenal, so it would not show sweat stains either. Moreover, Lex's entire back was covered, so nothing of his miserable state was actually shown in Barley's recording. By now, he didn't even need to waste any energy wiping the sweat off his face, for it would evaporate right on his skin. The dark impurities exiting his body evaporated as well. Oddly enough, however, since they were only considered impurities now that Lex had grown much stronger, after evaporating they didn't release a putrid or horrid smell, but actually smelled fresh and relaxing. After all, his body had been refined by the lotus many times, so even the dirt in his body was valuable now. All of this combined to create the ultimate scene for Barley's recording, so much so that even the dwarf had not realized it yet. Time seemed to lose meaning as Lex marched. At some point, without Lex realizing it, the difficulty of his task went from absolutely impossible to only almost completely impossible. The drastic reduction in difficulty was due to various factors, but when they combined together they allowed Lex to finally gather up the energy, and he began to jog. Every inch of his entire being was aching, but Lex had a smile on his face, because his increased speed finally allowed him to feel a bit of wind on his face. Although the wind itself was searing hot, like air coming out of a burning stove, it was still an improvement for Lex. The pleasant sensation further fueled Lex's motivation, and soon he broke into a run. To be clear, it was not that it had become easier to traverse the area so he was running, but that he was forcing more out of himself. After all, he knew that if he wanted to achieve what he had in mind, the difficulty was going to get much worse. Although it seemed an eternity, especially to Lex, eventually he reached the dragon. He slowed down, panting and heaving, as he approached the dragon's face. By now he could no longer rely on his eyes to look at the dragon, even his left eye, for the strain was so great he felt he would go blind if he did. He had to use his spirit sense, and even that suffered from mild burns as it came in contact with the dragon's scales. He had to lift his face to look up at the dragon properly. Just to reach its lower lip, Lex would have to climb dozens of feet. It was hard to determine the exact size of the dragon, for the dragon's might was messing with his perception. Even this close, he could not tell just how big it was. He did not spend any time admiring it, for the hardest task was still in front of him. What he had done so far was only the warm-up. He reached forward and touched the dragon's scale, his skin sizzling due to the scale's heat, but he didn't withdraw it. There was also the sound of a mighty roar inside his mind that nearly made him fall unconscious, but fortunately it did not last. He raised his hand till it met the groove of one scale ending and another beginning. There was barely enough space for his fingertips to grip it, but that would have to do. It was at this moment he cursed himself for weighing more than 700 pounds. He knew he would regret that sooner or later. But he had no time to lament, for the longer he took, the more of his skin burned, literally. He lifted himself up, and fell back to the floor. What, 700 pounds? Right now, it felt as if Lex weighed 70,000 pounds. What's more, it was not easy to leverage the entire weight only on his burning fingertips. Lex blew out air from his nose, dissatisfied with the situation. Then he licked each of his fingertips, moistening them a bit, and began again. This time, he did not fall, and he began to climb slowly and steadily. Just as he was making steady progress, and he was about to reach the lower lip of the dragon, the crown on his head cracked, and spirit pull began influencing him again, if only a little. But Lex was a single-minded beast now, so did not stop climbing nor did he stop cultivating, even if his thoughts had drifted elsewhere. The only redeeming factor in this situation was that the treasure that was tainted with the dragon's obsession was a little far from the dragon, and so he was not facing spirit pull at its worst. The lotus on Lex's back was stimulated, just a bit, by the dragon's aura, but it was too exhausted from healing that strange poison for Lex's system, so it did not wake up. The castle above Lex trembled, and dust fell from the roof, but he did not notice. He just kept climbing, crossing the lower lip and then the top. Only a little more, and he would reach the snout, which would make his remaining journey easy, at least by comparison. But then, the crown on his head suffered another crack, and Lex got lost even deeper in his thoughts. The strange thing was, the deeper Lex got lost in his thoughts, the faster he would climb, as if he was instinctively ignoring the copious amounts of pain in his body. Unbelievably, Lex managed to reach the snout, and stood up on it, his posture perfectly refined. His cultivation technique began circulating even faster, and the effects on his body were noticeable by now. Lex did not pause for long, and continued to walk, the crown suffering even more cracks. What was strange was that he should have diverted his path as he was influenced by the spirit pull and gone towards the treasure, but instead Lex never changed his path. Lex had formed an obsession of his own while fighting against the dragon's aura, and now his obsession was competing directly against the dragon's. Finally, he reached the forehead. Chapter 775 Ultimate Fertilizer. Although nothing in particular was happening at the lowest level, and Lex was the only one moving about, a strange stillness enveloped the hall the moment he reached the forehead. The pressure of dragon's might on Lex did not reduce, but at the same time felt as if it had lost its edge. Barley, the dwarf in the distance, held his breath as he tried to come to terms with what he was seeing. This was beyond anything he had expected. He thought Lex was going to go steal treasure, not blaspheme the dragon like this. The value of his recording just skyrocketed. Lex slowed down only a bit as an instinctive hesitation filled him, but he overcame it momentarily as he approached the spot he had seen from a distance. In the center of the dragon's forehead, there was a single scale that was elevated above the rest. Unlike the rest of the scales, this one had unusual jagged edges, as if something was once attached to this scale but had been ripped out. All that remained now was a single scale higher than the rest. Lex stepped onto the dragon and he, who was supposed to have lost lucidity under the effects of the treasure spirit pull, spoke softly. Before lording your might and prestige over me, realize that you are the one sitting under my feet. Even without a soul, the dragon seemed to have been stimulated by Lex's words and its dragon's might erupted like a volcano. The inherent pride of a dragon could not be besmirched even in death. Lex coughed out some blood and immediately shut his eyes, for he felt they were about to pop out of his skull. Tiny rips tore in his skin all over and he began to bleed profusely. A roar that could destroy planets rang inside Lex's mind and shook his very soul, yet Lex's expression did not change at all. The matter of fact was that Lex really was affected by spirit pull, but his own indomitable will and pride clashed against the dragon's. Right now, Lex was not acting consciously, but rather completely according to his subconscious thoughts and feelings. He really did believe that dragons were not fit to show their might in front of him, at least dead ones. As if nothing had happened at all, Lex sat cross-legged on the elevated scale and closed his eyes. It was as if he was finding a comfortable position within the gut-wrenching, soul-crushing pressure bearing down on him. A moment later, he began to cultivate once again. A whirlwind of heated spirit energy formed around Lex and began to be absorbed by his body. His aura, which had previously been undergoing a steady growth, exploded with a powerful hunger and began to devour the dragon's might. His cultivation technique was revolving at unprecedented speeds and began to immediately change Lex as he was nourished by the special spirit energy within this hall, as well as the unique spirit energy flooding into his body the scale beneath him. Everything about Lex, at that moment, began to undergo an evolution. His cultivation, which had barely moved from the beginning of the golden core realm, began to slowly inch upwards. His very position on the cosmic ascendance spectrum began to elevate. His mind, body, and soul were beginning to grow stronger rapidly, as if he was being nourished by the dragon itself. The impurities in his body started to leak out of his body, no longer as fine black grains, but in the form of steam. His hair started to take on a brownish tint similar to the dragon's scales underneath him. His skin, which had ripped all over, healed almost immediately, and then began to shed as if he was molting. Even the lotus tattoo on his back started to warm up, as if it too was absorbing some of the dragon's energy. Barley, who was still recording, began to tremble as fear started to creep into his heart. His incredibly sharp senses had picked up on the fact that the dragon's might affecting him had reduced almost imperceptibly. Yet such a thing was not a cause for celebration, for another, more intimidating aura took its place by the same measure that the dragon's might reduced. No matter what he thought of Lex earlier, right now his body was telling him to flee. If the man who dared to absorb a dragon's essence discovered that Barley had been recording him with sinister intentions, he would not be long for this world, especially in his weakened state. After all, this was not something that had never been done before, albeit never in the method that Lex was using. It had to be known that the aura of a dragon would taint any who dared absorb their essence, and would become a permanent enemy of the dragons. This was no laughing matter, and no longer something the dwarf dared to be a part of. He ended the recording and began to retreat while Lex was still busy. He had to leave this planet immediately. While this was happening, the strain on Lex was slowly and steadily decreasing. This was a result of the decreasing dragon's might, his increasing aura, as well as his own increasing strength. In a few minutes, he already reached the middle of the golden core realm. He also finally woke up and gained full lucidity, as well as all the memories of everything he did recently. He would have shuddered and considered himself lucky that he had not succumbed to the dragon's obsession, but at the moment he was feeling too euphoric to worry. Although he had endless motivation and dedication when he started out on his endeavor, planning to do something and actually achieving it were two entirely different concepts. He had actually crossed the barrier between so many realms and managed to conquer this trial in his path. Given that the dragon was already dead, but even so the challenge had been difficult enough. He felt an unprecedented thrill and excitement course through his veins. He felt like he was truly alive at this moment, and had achieved something legendary. At the same time, he felt an overwhelming urge to go and complete other impossible tasks and test what his limits truly were. A massive, genuine grin painted his face, but even that was not enough to contain his joy. He began laughing freely and loudly, without caring to hold back at all. He was sitting atop a mighty dragon, something he would have not even dared to imagine before. Although he always had faith in his own ability, and preferred to get things himself over just being handed amazing gifts by the system, it was a good feeling to finally prove it. Once he was done laughing, he quickly resumed his focus on cultivating. He could feel that he had improved too much too quickly, and that he was about to reach his limit. But until that happened, he wanted to get the most out of this chance. He finally had time to inspect the changes taking place in his body and evaluate his growth. He noticed, for the first time, how his aura was directly competing with dragon's might, and even slowly absorbing it. It was transcending the realm where it could only be felt, and entering the realm where he could directly influence the world itself with his aura. He could feel that his aura would suppress, subdue, and overwhelm his foes, while at the same time it would protect, reassure, and to a certain degree, reinvigorate his allies. His aura could also protect him from various negative influences, such as minor curses, divination, fate manipulation, mind attacks as well as soul attacks. But these last few aspects were still weak, and would require further strengthening of his aura to be effective in case of stronger opponents. His eyes flashed open and the world itself seemed to feel the pressure of his gaze. It was as if, through his gaze, Lex could employ something similar to dragon's might. After a moment's consideration, he decided to name this ability domination. His cultivation finally slowed down and his aura stopped growing. The dragon's might in the hull could still oppress him greatly, but it was no longer to the point where Lex would collapse at the simplest carelessness. Lex was not sure what treasure the mystery man referred to when he told Lex to come here, but he was more than satisfied with this opportunity. After all, now that he had cultivated on top of a dragon, he did not plan on cultivating anywhere else. There was a flash of emotion in Lex's eyes as he summoned a single golden key and stared at it. It was time to bring the ultimate fertilizer to the inn. He used the dragon's scale to break the key, teleporting the living carcass of the dragon to the inn, before he himself teleported away as well. Although he had to loot, yes, he also had to make sure no one stole his fertilizer from him. Chapter 776, No Time. Inside the inn, the activity levels seemed to have dropped drastically. Many of the guests who were here were actually in hiding, while the rest were on vacation. That was because the entire realm seemed to be heading towards war. If the higher-ups were stressed about it, the ones lower down on the chain of command would clearly be even more worried. They were also much busier. Although the Midnight Inn was an excellent place, without sufficient money, one could not spend enough time there. As such, it was not really a long-term solution to avoiding the conflicts. This caused most of the inn's usual tenants to be busy working or cultivating, leaving behind only a small percentage of guests. Even so, dozens if not hundreds of guests came and went at any given time. This was a sight that had become all too common, and no longer aroused any attention among those who frequented the inn. Only those who were coming to the inn for the first time were likely to stop and admire the beautiful scenery. Naturally, as with every norm, there were exceptions. In the clearing where new guests arrived, a single mass of guests suddenly appeared. At first, it was only the size of the new guest that attracted attention of all the guests, for at its height point, which was on its back where its wings were folded, the guest was nearly 4,000 feet, 1220 meters, tall. The length of its body, even with its tail folded up, was also around 4,000 feet as well. It went without saying that the arrival of such a figure would attract the eye of all nearby guests. But that was only just an instinctive reaction that anyone would have. A moment later, once they overcame the enormity of the size of this new guest, and processed who it actually was, they were startled. It was a dragon, and a massive one at that. This was even larger than the previous dragon that had appeared at the inn before, as a guard. Moreover, there was one very significant difference between this dragon and the previous one. This dragon was very active within the Swirling galaxy, and thus was considered a very high-level VIP among many forces. Various amounts of information were also available to multiple forces and organizations, depending on their power and authority levels. Thus a few guests, especially among the devils, immediately recognized it. It would not be inaccurate to say that this dragon was one of the most well-known celebrities or prominent figures to appear at the inn. Just as some guests were basking in the glory of appearing so near a dragon, all without being crushed by its ferocious dragon's might, that the dragon disappeared. This did not arouse too much surprise as no one expected a dragon to ride a golf cart to its destination. The fact that it had appeared in the same location as them when it arrived was already humbling enough for it. The appearance and subsequent disappearance of the dragon did not arouse too much attention, besides the usual excitement of witnessing one of the overlords of not only this realm but the entire universe. But certain figures who recognized the dragon made a mental note of its appearance. Lex, who had also teleported to the inn, would naturally not come over personally to teleport the dragon over. Instead, as soon as he appeared, he used his authority to expand his private meditation room until it was large enough to fit the dragon and teleported it over. Now, inside the inn, Lex could finally observe the dragon without the interference of its natural aura, and its massive size was finally revealed to him. Somehow, with all the mystique removed, the dragon looked even more impressive than when he could not even perceive the size of its existence. Each of its scales was more beautiful than the most exquisite piece of jade, each curve and groove pleasing to the eye. Its mighty stature and dominating figure produced an ethereal aura of their own, and was independent of its spot on the cosmic ascendance spectrum. That aura belonged solely to itself and was ingrained deep within its bones. Although Lex did not know its history, standing before it he was sure that it had raised many storms in its lifetime. Yet, oddly enough, its death was extremely mysterious. Lex did not know how much he would believe the words of the creature that had told him how the dragon had died, but even if he believed everything, it left too many questions. But now was not the time for that. Lex was still on a time crunch, and wanted to explore the depths of the dragon's hoard. But before that, he just had to make sure that nothing would happen to the dragon if he left it here, so he scanned it. Name, Pelvalen Ur Bahatnagorjan. Age, 670,809,524. Sex, male. Cultivation details? Species, dragon. Midnight and prestige level, 1. Bloodline? Condition, an empty vessel, a body without a soul. Unless the soul revives, or a new, suitable soul enters, the body will eventually die. Remarks, the most valuable item inside a dragon's treasure chest is always the dragon itself. Lex's eyes gleamed as various ideas crossed his mind. Since this was a living dragon, sort of, if Lex could harvest its benefits, besides just absorbing its might and cultivation, then he could raise the power of the Midnight Inn by a massive amount. Although he had not read in detail, even he had come across the random articles on the Henali portal about how some lucky cultivator found a drop of dragon blood, or a random dragon bone, and then used it to become an unrivaled powerhouse in their respective region. The possibilities were endless. Lex had trouble suppressing his grin and even had the urge to utter the forbidden words, "my precious," as he looked at the dragon. But ultimately he tore away his feverish gaze from the dragon. Now, it was time to loot. He teleported back to the hall and found himself free, falling from a height. It made sense. When he teleported away, he was up in the air above a dragon. But such a fall barely had any effect on him at all. Now, free of the oppressive aura of dragon's might, he could move freely. Moreover, he had built a mental resistance to spirit pull, so he had no trouble retaining his lucidity. The moment his body crashed onto the ground, he burst forward at full speed. The sudden absence of dragon's might would not go unnoticed, and it was only a matter of time before others came to investigate. He was determined to get as much as possible done before he ran into that search party. First order of business was the treasure that reeked of the dragon's obsession. It was not at all hard to find, as Lex could clearly feel its pull, not to mention the massive pedestal that had been built for it. An oval, rainbow-colored jewel that was 30 feet, 9.1 meters, across was placed on a red pillow that looked like it was made from the feathers of some mystical being. Even beside the obsession that had gripped the jewel, Lex could feel an ancient and ominous aura leaking from it. Faintly, deep within, he could see the outline of a figure seemingly trapped within. Soft, silver characters shimmered in the air around it, as if the jewel itself was causing characters to be formed. Lex could also feel the jewel absorbing an unusual aura from the planet, nourishing itself. Around the pedestal, there were various rows of seats, as if a crowd regularly gathered around it to worship the jewel. In fact, faint traces of divinity could be sensed in the vicinity as well. It was as if Lex could not be bothered to continue observing the jewel for now. The moment he was sure that it was safe, he put the jewel as well as the pillow inside the massive spatial drum on his back. In fact, using nothing but brute strength, Lex ripped the pedestal out of the ground as well, and placed it in there as well. He was sure it was worth a lot. He immediately took out the black jade that would guide him to the Peronian jade and made a beeline for the direction it pointed him in. As he ran, he also stored every chair, table, ornament and decoration he came across, because they were all leaking thick, heated spirit energy, and he was certain they were valuable. Soon, he found a small sealed room upon following the jade's directions. The seal was not to prevent intruders, but to lock in the aura of its contents, so Lex had no problem entering. Inside was a black tree that was, supposedly, made of Peronian jade. It looked identical to the compass Lex had, and once again gave off an unusual aura that spoke of extreme vicissitudes. Upon making sure it was safe, Lex put it in his drum as well. He had no time to admire ancient treasures. He only had time to loot. Chapter 7, 77 Pool. While Lex was busy with his looting, within the Milky Way a number of small drones explored the vacuum of space. Telescopes, formations and other means to observe the universe at large could only provide the most basic information about space within a galaxy, as many various kinds of spiritual energies and other anomalies hid endless secrets. These drones, sent out by the AI once they arrived on Earth, were conducting a survey of nearby space for exactly this reason. After all, unlike other races, the AI did not care if the Earth was inside a dead zone. The concentration of spiritual energy mattered little to them. After all, they only cared about valuable materials, and even dead zones could give birth to those. Using the harvest from dead zones, the AI could create unique bodies for themselves. It was while conducting this routine survey, the drone discovered a rogue planet that hadn't been detected on any of its previous scans. Following protocol, it went closer to investigate. As soon as it was in range, it scanned the planet and, to its great surprise, discovered that the readings from the planet already existed in its database. This was a known planet, but its location was not where it was supposed to be. After all, Polbitby was in another galaxy altogether. But at this moment, it was right in front of it, disturbingly close to Earth. Immediately, it sent back this information, for it could be extremely valuable. Lex did not need his instincts to tell him that there was more than meets the eye regarding the Peronian jade, but he had already signed a contract to give it away, so there was no use pondering over it. He would study it a bit more when he had the chance, but for now he stopped thinking about it and exited once more. The final hall that constituted the dragon's hoard was large and elaborately decorated with immaculate stonework and masonry, with endless jewels, valuable metals and various stones. Although the decorations were many, they all had one thing in common, which was that they gave off an unusual, heated spirit energy. Lex already knew that there were different kinds of spirit energies and that they served different purposes, but for now Lex was too low-leveled, so to him it was all the same. What was more important to him was that each and every one of those items were valuable, and to a degree, could also act as fertilizers. But instead of immediately rushing to them, Lex first calmly surveyed the entire hall. Just because Lex was in a rush did not mean he lost his professionalism. All things had to be done efficiently and in the correct order. He would first loot the actual treasures in this hall, before turning his attention to other, lesser valuables. The vast majority of the hall was an open space, which made sense considering the dragon's size. But there were 12 smaller halls and rooms, similar to the one which contained the Peronian jade. This also made sense. After all, there was limited space and not every hall could be massive. Moreover, if even Fenrir could change its size, how would the dragon not be able to? Speaking of Fenrir, the pup had struggled a lot under the dragon's might, but it had been too stubborn to retreat as well. Once the pressure from the dragon disappeared, it collapsed. But by the time Lex returned, he was nowhere in sight. Yet, through his connection to the pup, Lex knew exactly where it was. It was doing the same thing as Lex, it was looting. Lex chuckled, and then swiftly entered the nearest hall. This room was, surprisingly, a small study containing endless books and crystals containing information. Lex swiped them all. The next room was a kitchen, and had a massive storage treasure filled to the brim with frozen carcasses, all radiating a powerful aura. The kitchen also had endless other fresh ingredients. After storing them in his own spatial equipment, Lex had to waste some time returning to the inn. After all, he could not place one spatial equipment in another's, so what Lex referred to as the spatial freezer had to manually be dropped off. He took the opportunity to empty his equipment as well, before returning to the hoard. The third room Lex entered had been ransacked already by Fenrir, leaving not a single speck of dust. Lex did not know whether to laugh or cry when he saw this, so he quickly moved to the next room. This room was a little special, in that its design seemed to fulfill some purpose. Shaped like a dome, the room had a massive pit inside of it filled to the brim with blood. Lex was immediately reminded of what Mary had requested and scanned the blood with his spirit sense for the scale, but encountered an unusual problem. The blood was incredibly thick, and resisted the penetration of Lex's spirit sense. If he wanted to look for the scale she had requested, he would have to get inside. Or he put his hand atop the blood and began sucking it inside his spatial drum. Lex had no interest in taking a literal blood bath, so this was an excellent alternative. As the blood slowly drained, the immense size of the pit was revealed as even 10 feet down, it had not reached the bottom. Lex was waiting for the pool to end, while at the same time making a mental note to look into what this blood could possibly be used for, when he noticed something in the pool. There was a figure swimming within. Could it be the baby dragon that Mary had mentioned earlier? Lex wondered warily. It had to be known that even a newborn dragon was in the earth immortal realm, and was not something he could fight off. But a moment later, his expression froze. A blood-covered wolf was revealed, and looked around wondering where the pool was disappearing to. It was having such a good time swimming. Chapter 7, 78 Ring. You're going to stink of blood, Lex said with a frown, though Fenrir didn't care about that. In fact, he was distressed that Lex was taking away his pool. Woof woof woof. Fine, I'll leave the blood alone. But check the pool if there's a scale inside, I need it. The pup immediate, plunged deep inside the pool, anxious to find the scale lest Lex continues to drain the blood. A gleam flashed through Lex's eyes. Although Fenrir was sometimes silly, he was actually very intelligent. If it was so attached to the blood, it must be benefiting it greatly somehow. Lex naturally would not covet an opportunity gained by Fenrir, but that did not stop him from contemplating if the blood would be helpful to the other beasts inside the inn. He did not think the galactic sovereign turtle needed any help, but Little Blue had been a part of the inn for a long time. Although Lex did not have too much of a personal connection with it, that did not mean that Lex did not care about it. A moment later, Fenrir came out of the pool with a remorseful look on its face. "Woof woof," the pup said. There was a scale at the bottom, but it was too heavy for the pup to move. The pup was scared that Lex would drain the pool to get to the scale, so it mentioned that the blood was actually nice and warm and didn't feel bad. Lex sighed, and then jumped in. The warmth Fenrir mentioned was actually scalding hot, to the extent that even Lex's freshly upgraded body turned red with subtle signs of a mild burn. The pool was much deeper than Lex expected, and he sank for about 300 feet, 91 meters, before he reached the boot. He naturally could not use his eyes to look around, and his spirit sense wasn't working either, so he could only feel around to look for the scale. It was easier to find than expected, for it covered nearly the entire bottom of the pit. He did not experiment with the weight, despite his curiosity for how much it weighed, and simply placed it within his drum. Nothing unexpected happened, so Lex swam back to the top and exited the pool safely. He was half expecting his body to absorb the blood or something along those lines, considering that Fenrir was so excited about it, but it had no effect on him. "Are you sure you want to stay here?" Lex asked with hesitation when he couldn't figure out the benefit of the blood, but Fenrir was adamant. He only nodded, and left the pup up to his devices. He quickly began going through the remaining halls. He encountered a greenhouse filled with various potted plants. Lex could not put them in his spatial equipment, so he had to consider whether it was worth it to waste time teleporting to and back to the inn every time. After all, for him to return to the inn was not instantaneous and would take a while. Ultimately, he decided it was worth it. Anything at this level would be unbelievably valuable. He grabbed as many pots as he could manage and teleported to the inn, instantly dropped the pots in the greenhouse near the turtle. Before the turtle could even realize what was happening, Lex had already disappeared. But the time the turtle analyzed the first pot, a dozen more appeared. A tinge of excitement was born in the turtle's eyes as he began to salivate, and looked from one plant to another. From time to time, more pots appeared, stimulating the turtle's heart. Each and every potted plant he saw was supposed to have gone extinct. That was the information on plants it was inheriting from within its bloodline, so the fact that he saw even a single sample was unbelievable, let alone multiple different extinct plants. He could possibly bring these plants back from extinction if only the circumstances were right. Ambition suddenly took hold of the young turtle's heart, and the horn on its forehead began to glow without its knowledge. All of this was unknown to Lex, who took an entire 10 minutes to transport all the plants to the inn. Without wasting a single breath, he dashed to the next hall, and the one after that, and the one after that. Despite the amazing auras each of them had, Lex did not pause to study them. He had been hoping that any one of them might turn out to be a system, but unfortunately he was disappointed. Like that, he made his way to the last hall. But upon entering, Lex paused, for the hall was empty. He frowned. He was sure Fenrir had not been here, so where could the contents of the hall have gone? He used his spirit sense and even tried to listen to his instincts, but was not able to discover anything, despite the obvious pedestal that had been prepared for an individual item. Whatever it was gone. Lex turned around and left. Although he was curious, he could not waste time to sate his curiosity. What he failed to notice was that as soon as he left, a ring made of wood reappeared on the pedestal, as if it had always been there. With all the rooms and halls explored, there was only one item remaining here that Lex felt was incalculably valuable. It was the massive chandelier hanging far up above. It was not made of glass or crystal, and bore no elaborate stone or metal work. Instead, it seemed to be made entirely of molten rock, held together through some mysterious means. Moreover, it was the primary source for the heated spiritual energy within the hall. Lex did not need to understand what this spiritual energy was to know it would obviously be valuable, so bent down and jumped up, causing his body to go soaring up into the air as if he could actually fly. He grabbed the chandelier and pulled it free from the ceiling. That's when things went horribly wrong. Chapter 779 Hunt. From the moment Lex came to this planet, he had been suffering from various extreme temperatures. As if that was not enough, the temperatures had an element of spirituality to them so that even Lex could not avoid being affected. From the extreme cold on the surface, to the boiling heat within the dragon's hall, he had weathered it all without much complaint. After all, what was there to complain about being too hot or cold? He spent his entire life as a mortal regulating temperatures. But there were some extremes that even he could not tolerate. The moment he pulled out the chandelier, as if he pulled out a plug stopping a drain, molten lava started to fall from the hole left behind. Hovering in the air, with nothing to hold on to, Lex could not avoid getting splashed by the unusual gray-colored lava. Lex didn't immediately suffer burns, but he could tell that if he were exposed to it too long, it was only a matter of time before he was cooked. Remarkably, his suit seemed to be tolerating the lava better than him. Lex crashed onto the floor, but he didn't remain covered in lava the whole time. He put the lava that had splashed onto him into his spatial drum alongside the chandelier and quickly jumped to the side as soon as he landed. Although this trick had worked once, he could tell that the lava was putting a strain on his drum. If he added any more, he would cause the drum to collapse. In the center of the hall, a stream of lava was falling down, forming an expanding puddle. Unless the lava stopped falling in, it was only a matter of time before this hall was filled entirely. "I'm going up, don't stay here too long," Lex told Fenrir through his spirit sense, before rushing up the stairs. Although the first encounter with lava had disturbed him a bit, the situation had not deteriorated fortunately. How was he supposed to know that what he unplugged was actually the switch for the dragon's regular lava shower? It did not like the cold temperature of the planet, and so regularly washed itself in those flames. Moreover, since that lava was used to bathe the dragon, it could absolutely not be normal. Perhaps many of the treasures in the hoard might not be as valuable as a drop of that lava, for a dragon would not allow its scales to be tainted with anything impure. The skin on Lex's face, which had suffered the splash of that lava, also soon recovered from its blushing state, and looked fresher and more vibrant than ever before. He quickly climbed up to the floor with various prisons, and then froze. Although Lex had not paid attention to many of the details, even his lack of specific attention resulted in a state where he could recall most things in his environment. He immediately noticed that a single dwarf was missing. His eyes swayed to the various prisons and discovered nothing amiss, but the disappearance of a body was not normal at all. Upon being unable to discover anything, Lex skipped over the bodies and went to the next floor. This floor only had prisoners, and Lex was not interested in collecting slaves, so all he could do was move on to the next floor. Although he had no recollection of having passed through the subsequent floors, that did not slow down Lex at all. He was able to hone in on the most valuable treasures on each floor and took them, leaving the rest behind. He only managed to cover 3 floors like this before he encountered others. Countless fraggles in heavy armor were fighting against elves, dwarves, and other races. Normally the fraggles would not be able to come this low due to the dragon's might, but as the dragon itself had disappeared, so had that deterrence. All the fraggles in the vicinity were gripped with fear even greater than that of the impending abomination invasion at the thought of their lord dying, and so they rushed in to investigate. That's when they found that their castle had already been infiltrated. The battle was chaotic and bloody, with body parts flying everywhere and screaming echoing in the halls. A mad fervor had gripped everyone, as the fraggles were in a rush to confirm their lord's status while the others wanted to loot. Amidst all of this, Lex never actually slowed down his looting. He directly ignored the combat and continued to pick out anything and everything he thought was valuable. His actions were noticed by more than just a few, and they all took an opportunity to attack him, but the attacks could not even cause his clothes to crease, let alone injure him. Lex did not even bother to acknowledge the attacks coming his way, except to speed up all his actions. After a few minutes, he already got everything he wanted and hurried to the next floor, leaving many who saw him bewildered. He came from down below, one of the elves noticed, and rushed down during the distraction Lex had caused. Like a domino falling, as soon as the first went down, everyone else began to follow. There were a few, however, who instead chased after Lex. He definitely got the best stuff, already seeing as how he came from down below. As soon as Lex entered the next floor, he froze. Of all the things he was expecting to find inside a dragon's hoard, he was not expecting a spaceship collection. Moreover, all of these ships were much larger than his silent wanderer, and seemed better equipped as well. How the hell was he going to plunder these? Just as he was admiring one up close, a frozen spike came out from the distance and hit the ship, causing it to tremble. Although the ship did not suffer too much damage, if such a thing continued it would only be a matter of time before it broke. Lex frowned. Not a single one of these came with a spatial equipment in which they could be stored, and Lex could not fit any of them inside his spatial equipment either. In the end, there was only one solution. He would break off the bits that looked the most expensive and have Xeon study them later. Maybe he should also invest in getting a few spaceship engineers. Lex bolted and entered the spaceship. He knew that the two most valuable things inside a ship were its ammunition and its energy source. He planned on getting plenty of them, and anything else he could get his hands on. Once again a similar scene reappeared where Lex was being attacked from all angles, but he was ignoring all of it. He did not know the reason, but for now only golden core cultivators had made it down so far. With that being the case, did Lex even need to fight back? In fact, fighting back would waste more time than just ignoring them, so that's what he did. More or less, his blatant dismissal of all incoming attacks intimidated those around him, and they even began to hesitate. That was, until a mournful scream was heard throughout the castle, rocking the mountain range itself. Even Lex paused, for he felt in that scream for the first time the power of an immortal. A human has desecrated the Lord Dragon. All Fraggles, find and kill the human, the voice roared, shattering every mirror and glass within the entire mountain range. Lex's expression changed, but instead of running he just sped up his looting. He didn't know how his actions had been detected, but he could tell that whoever yelled was far away from him, for now, at least. But the reason for his exposure was simple. The two remaining dwarfs from the first party were trying to escape, but were too injured to do so with so many guards in their way. Although they had already prepared an escape plan, to make sure things were as chaotic as possible, thus making their escape easier, Barley threw out multiple crystals containing the recording of Lex atop the dragon. Lightsville, it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. When they were finally discovered, all the Fraggles went mad in search of Lex, making it easier for the dwarves to escape. After all, once they saw that the two dwarves were not their targets, they would ignore them. Normally there would have been a fight, but right now they only cared about hunting down Lex. "Did you manage to complete the mission?" Terrell asked, as he limped along with Barley. "I couldn't loot the bottom floor, but rest assured, I left traces of Valder dust there. As for what happens next, that's none of our concern. That human might even take the blame for everything as long as we stay hidden." "What about the others' bodies?" Terrell asked, thinking of his former companions. "Each of them came prepared. In an hour, their bodies will dissolve, leaving no trace. I told that human my name. Will that be a problem?" "Only if he escapes here alive." Chapter 780 Warzone. A part of Lex wondered why he was even bothering to steal so many spaceship-related things when he had no real need for spaceships at all. Was it just because they looked so cool? No, he was just preparing in advance to avoid issues in the future. After all, who knew when he would need a very cool-looking spaceship? Such justifications were going through Lex's mind as he continued his looting. He was spending longer on the level with the spaceship, but that was only because harvesting the energy sources and ammunition took longer than just grabbing it. Even reaching it required going through special procedures, lest they become tainted or compromised in some way. During this time, Lex was continuously attacked, which he was ignoring. But there was one fundamental difference now compared to before. Due to the sensitive nature of what he was harvesting, he would create a barrier around himself so the attacks would not accidentally hit the energy sources or volatile ammunition instead. Oh, and considering the fact that everyone was now hunting for a human, he also used notorious anonymity to hide his identity. After all, with various races attacking the castle altogether, he could easily just be some other race that was not well known. Or at least that was the hope. For what it was worth, his idea seemed to work. No one was targeting him because he was a human. Instead, his complete disregard for any attack targeting him made him the biggest target. Lex almost considered re-evaluating his tactics, but watching the frustration build up in his attackers, Lex felt a subtle sense of satisfaction. He really had to give it up to Jeeves. His idea to frustrate his enemies was not bad at all. But there was one very important factor he had to keep in mind. To return to the inn, he needed some time to teleport, and he could not be disturbed during that time frame. If he were attacked, his teleportation would be cancelled. As such, he needed to have an escape plan in mind, which included getting away from the crowd long enough to teleport away. Once he had been through most of the ships, Lex reluctantly went up to the next floor. He was unable to actually take away most of the energy sources, as he recognized them to be too unstable to handle the environment inside a spatial treasure. The next floor, unbelievably, looked more like an antique bottle collection than a dragon's hoard. Hundreds of thousands of glass, jade, plastic, or even metallic bottles were lined up in countless counters. But it was this mundane, unusual even, floor in which the fighting was most brutal and chaotic. A single moment to study the situation revealed why the situation was so different. Each of those bottles contained medicine. If that were all, perhaps Lex would not have paid any extra attention and would have randomly grabbed some of the pills. After all, his medical knowledge was fairly limited, so he would not know if they were anything special. But due to the intensity of the fighting, many bottles broke and freed the pills or syrups from their airtight containers. Lex's instincts were immediately attracted to some of the pills as if they could provide endless benefits, though only for the few brief moments before they were destroyed in the chaos. At the same time, it was strongly repulsed by others, as if they were extremely hazardous, even to him. In fact, due to the fighting and the constant destruction of medicinal bottles, all the ingredients were falling onto the floor and mixing with one another haphazardly. This should not have mattered much beyond the fact that each of these medicines was rare beyond measure in any galaxy, and could not be easily replicated regardless of wealth and power. But in this instance, the more important reason it mattered was because all the broken pills and syrups and ingredients were mixing and slowly combining to form a very lethal poison. With treasures in front of him, and a countdown timer in his mind motivating him, Lex burst forward at his full speed, grabbing bottles and entire shelves randomly and putting them in his drum. Perhaps Charles would be able to identify what these pills were used for. Despite feeling greatly attracted to various pills, Lex did not try eating any at the moment. He had already cultivated as much as his body could tolerate for now. And if these pills were still being targeted by his instincts, then they were absolutely phenomenal, and eating them now would only be a waste. Lex was gathering a lot of loot while also attracting a lot of hate, as seemed the norm by now, when something new finally happened. The entrance to the next floor burst open and an army of abominations came pouring in. Lex finally laid eyes on one and immediately understood why they were being called as such. With bodies that made no sense, these creatures made of ice attacked anyone near with absolute savagery. The creatures' bodies looked like blobs of Play-Doh mushed together by children, for the most part. They had tentacles coming out of odd places and hands and legs in inconvenient locations. All of this should have made them weak, but they were anything but. Their freezing bodies emitted a piercing chill that not only froze the body, but it froze spiritual energy as well. Those were just the common rabble among the abominations. Some of them seemed to perfectly imitate other fraggles, dwarves or beasts, and could even change shape as they wished or needed. The greatest threat of all, however, was not their unusual chill or their odd strength, but it was their numbers. Hundreds of them were pouring in from the door, and in fact many of them were trying to enlarge the opening by breaking the door apart so more of them could come in. Of course, neither their strength nor their chill had any significant effect on Lex, so he originally planned to break through them, but his plans quickly changed. A sense of foreboding filled him all of a sudden and he retreated quickly. These creatures were not simple at all. In fact, considering the fact that they did not previously exist on the planet, and only appeared recently, they may have something to do with the odd creature that killed the dragon. Once he had that thought, Lex immediately decided to end his little looting session. As much as he enjoyed it, he was not in dire need of any of it, and it was best to know when to rein in one's greed. But the situation kept getting worse. The sounds of devastating explosions rocked the castle, accompanied by earth-shattering tremors. Lex could not know the situation outside, but it seemed to be deteriorating quickly. He needed to retreat to somewhere he was no longer under attack so he could teleport out. Unfortunately, everyone else also had thoughts of retreating from the approaching army, so a stampede formed, crowding the tunnels. As if that was not enough, Lex felt a few incredibly strong spirit senses sweep the area. The Earth Immortal who had shouted earlier had arrived, and he was not alone. Crap, Lex muttered under his breath and pushed through the crowd, no longer bothering about who blocked his way. The repercussions of trying to be extremely efficient were revealing themselves now, as many of those who had attacked him previously without much success now tried to slow him down, whether it was out of pettiness or simply because Lex just frustrated them too much, he would never find out. That is because the next moment Lex's instinct suddenly screamed danger, and unable to do much else, he wrapped himself in endless layers of barriers. Something ripped through the ceiling above him and went smashing through the crowd, digging in deeper through the castle floors. Lex had not been directly under whatever tore through the ceiling, but even still all his barriers broke and he was thrown away to the side. At least he remained unhurt, but the same could not be said for the crowd that had been running with him. Feeling somewhat shell-shocked, Lex looked up through the hole in the castle. The sky outside was no longer dark as countless ships could be seen flying in the air, bombarding not just the castle, but anyone near it. "What the hell?" Lex exclaimed. It was a literal war zone outside, much more so than even when he came. Without hesitation, Lex jumped into the hole in front of him. No sane person would follow him, and he could the time he needed to teleport away. Unfortunately for him, the icy abominations were not sane by any measure, and they were more than just a few of them. Pretty soon, an army of abominations could be seen jumping down the hole, following Lex.